But welcome this morning. So I'm delivering with my colleague Gurmel. So thank you for our lovely introduction. I'm going to start us off this morning. So we are doing an update we presented over the summer on the upcoming changes with the clinical trial regs, GCP and the approvals process. And we're giving you an update now on where we are because we feel it's really important to keep you updated on this process as it's going so that you know things. Even if all we can say is at certain points, this is still in process, we want you to be able to have that awareness. So I'm going to kick us off to start with. I'm going to look at that update on the current position, as I said, with those new clinical trial regulations and with GCP. I'll then hand over to Gurmel, who will give an update on the current position with planned changes to the approvals process. And then we will have questions at the end. So I'm going to get started and I'm going to start with an initial recap, just going over where we were from last time, so you know that current position. I'll keep it brief because I know a lot of you are familiar with it already. So I'll give that recap and then I'll go over the recent updates. And so this is focusing on the risk proportionate approach and guidance documents. And I'll give a little bit of an update on some of the some information that recently came out about device studies as well. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about the GCP training requirements in line with this. Okay, so a little bit of the background, just as that recap, obviously. So we're currently on the Medicines for Human Use Clinical Trial Regulations 2004 and ICH GCP E6 R2. So it's a very long acronym. What we're moving to is the Clinical Trial Regulations 2025 and GCP E6 R3. So those are the new ones, and they will both be in place from the 28th of April next year. So we are currently in the middle of a 12-month implementation period for that, and we have been advised by the MHRA to be using this time to put our preparation in place. And to note as well, I know there's some people on the call who are working in non-CTIMP areas. Obviously, the clinical trial regulations legally apply to drug studies. GCP informs those, and it is a legal requirement for drug studies, but it's also a best practice requirement for non-drug studies. And some of the updates we'll talk about, particularly in Gurmel's side of things around approvals, some of the language updates will apply across all study types, not just drug studies. So yes, the 28th of April 2026, that's when we will have the new clinical trial regulations and the new GCP fully in force in the UK. The updated GCP R3 is already in place in Europe. Other places in the world are adopting it at different time points as well, but this is the time point that we're adopting in the UK. The reasons for this update, we've given lots of explanations for this previously, so I'll just go through a very light touch overview of why these updates are in place. Internationally, the GCP was brought in, and so our clinical trial regulations were due to be updated anyway, in line with Europe post-Brexit. And so they've been updated to mirror that. Initially, the Declaration of Helsinki was updated, and that has fed through to all the other regulations. So the primary reasons for these updates in the UK, as well as keeping up to speed with international guidance from GCP, is to adopt or to focus more strongly on a risk-based approach and encouraging that risk-based approach. This was already happening anyway, but there's just a greater emphasis and focus on it. A lot of the changes are there to support innovation. So basically using new trial design methods, using new technologies in how we're delivering our studies, particularly a strong focus on people using electronic systems in their research studies, and just trying to make sure the language in the regs and in GCP is robust enough to reflect those. The actual changes and requirements themselves haven't changed in principle, but it's just making it a little bit more robust and future-proofing. It's about bringing that consistency in around aligning that UK regulations with those global standards, as we've mentioned, in line with GCP, so they're both there. And it's also about bringing more flexibility to our approach, which links into that risk-based focus so that we can be a bit more risk proportionate to how we manage trial oversight. Essentially, what they're saying here is, if you're working on a very low risk drug study, you shouldn't have to have the exact same level of scrutiny and things in place as you would for a high risk, early phase drug study. If you're working with a licensed drug, for example, in primary care that may have been prescribed to someone anyway, we just want to collect some additional data on that, then you shouldn't have to have the same checks and things in place as you would for that early phase 1 drug study, for example, because there it could actually prevent those simpler low risk studies from happening or make them harder to run. So it's about that flexible approach, about that efficiency. And that's going to come in a lot when Gurmel is talking about the approvals process. So as part of this, there's obviously that big overhaul with approvals so that studies can be quicker and easier to open up. It's about data integrity, which links in a little bit along with technology and innovation there, about making sure with the rise of electronic systems in our studies that we are working, that the language and the regulations reflect the use of electronic systems so it is robust for that future proofing. And a really strong focus that we're seeing all the way through from the Declaration of Helsinki, GCP, to the regulations and to the guidance surrounding those regulations is on inclusion. So a much stronger focus and requirement on promoting diverse participant recruitment strategies so that we can improve the generalizability of our research findings, which is basically the definition of research. We should be able to take the findings from this research and they should be able to apply to the general population. So a really good example that we're currently working on with the GCP training around why a diverse participant recruitment strategy is important is the use of pulse oximeters, which were originally researched, I think, back in the 80s, and they were researched primarily on male bodies and participants with paler skin tones. And the outcome of that we're seeing now is that, I mean, we see very more different models now, but, you know, for females, for example, tend to have smaller digits. So sometimes some of these don't get accurate readings on females and you need smaller ones to get an accurate reading on the digit. But also the greater concern is that because they were designed, they for those that aren't familiar with how they work, they put a light beam through the finger to measure oxygen saturation in the blood. And actually research has shown that this isn't as effective on people with darker skin tones, and we're getting false readings of showing slightly higher oxygen levels. And we saw huge impacts on this during the COVID pandemic, where people with darker skin tones were showing that they had higher oxygen saturations than they did, and then they got very poorly because staff were following what those devices were saying. So that's just one example of where that really great focus on diverse participant recruitment strategies is important. Okay, so those are the reasons for the updates. Just a general sort of overview of those key changes that are coming in. So as I've mentioned, there's a lot of changes to the approvals process to streamline it, to make it quicker and easier to set up studies. In particular, if you're working on low risk drug studies, there are changes to how the MHRA approve those versus high risk drug studies. So if you're working on a drug study, as I mentioned, with a drug that's already licensed for use, then there will be a different route to how that's approved by the MHRA versus those that need that much higher level of scrutiny. So it's keeping that scrutiny there where it's needed, but removing it for those low risk studies where it may then become a burden. Transparency is one of the other big changes. So it is now, or will be, a legal requirement for the findings of the study to be published, made public within 12 months of the study ending, whether they're negative or positive findings. And this includes offering a lay summary to research participants as well. Okay, so that transparency, so that is, where were we? So yeah, that's that requirement to publish that lay summary at the end of a study and get that findings out there. There are also changes to safety reporting and pharmacovigilance. These are primarily around sponsor requirements. And again, it's about trying to remove some of the unnecessary burden where there may have been duplication in reporting, so it's easier to run these. And there's also changes to consent. We are being allowed or permitted to use what's called simplified consent models for those lower risk studies. I did a workshop on this at the Support and Delivery Day earlier this year for those that may have been there. Basically, it's, again, if you're working in that very low risk study, a drug that's already licensed for use, for example, in a GP surgery, and the GP was going to prescribe it to the participant anyway, but they just want to collect a bit of extra data on that participant's experience, then going through the same sort of long laborious consent process as you would for an early phase drug study doesn't make sense. And so there's guidance out there to allow sponsors to design a simplified consent model where it would be a much simpler, less intense process for the researcher and the participant in the appropriate settings. And there's a lot of guidance around that, and obviously it has to go through ethical approval as well. But overall, this revision supports a more streamlined and flexible approach to the regulation of clinical trials. So it is that risk-based, risk-proportionate approach, removing unnecessary administrative burdens on those lower risk studies or duplication that might be there for trial sponsors, but also it's there to protect the interests of the trial participants as well. Some other changes coming in, so there's some language changes that you're probably becoming more familiar with now. The top one, which I'm still shocked is only just coming in now, we're changing from subjects to participants across all legislation, GCP, Declaration of Helsinki, because we do not subject people to our research, they willingly participate in it. Trial site is changing to trial location, basically to reflect that we're using a lot more electronic and remote studies, so it's not always a physical site. Amendment is changing to modification, which Gurmel will talk about later on around approvals for you. And the term essential documents is being replaced with essential records, again to reflect that we're working with more electronic systems, and so it may not necessarily be a physical document. So those are the terms that are changing. Another term that's coming in that was in place before, but there's much greater focus on it, is critical to quality factors. So you'll be seeing another lovely acronym out there, CTQ. It's basically identifying those aspects of a study, of a trial, that may have the greatest impact on participant safety, data integrity, or the credibility of the results. It builds in to that enhanced focus on risk-based approach. So it may be that you're seeing the term critical to quality factors being used more, and maybe something that's being asked to identify at different points in a study, but you'll be seeing that more. And the importance of risk as well, as I've mentioned, there's much stronger focus on this, and I will be giving you an update shortly on where we are with that risk view on that now, and whose responsibility it is. One of the other changes as well is who can be an investigator. So by investigator, we mean principal investigator at site. It used to just be doctor, nurse, dentist, pharmacist, and it's been updated now to have a much broader list. This isn't an exhaustive list itself. It's basically someone that is a registered health professional with the council. So this is a list that the MHRA brought up to show the different roles that may be there. Obviously, this has to fit in line with the protocol having been approved. If a protocol says this is the person that can be the principal investigator, and it has to fit in line with local requirements as well, because some health boards may have different requirements over who can and can't be a PI of a drug study. And the proviso, the little aspect alongside that is obviously if you do have someone who's a non-medic who is a PI on that study, they do have to be appropriately trained to undertake that role. So we have to, evidence that, but they need appropriate support for any medical decisions in regards to that trial. So that would need to be there, documented in the protocol and in any local policies as well. And just to summarise, while we're still in that recap, this is just summarising some of the changes to timings. A lot of these are probably more relevant to sponsor than site. So, we've got a change to the time frame that sponsors are required to report urgent safety measures to the MHRA. This does not change with their relationship with site. It's just bringing them in line with the rest of the world. If a trial has had their approval, but it hasn't actually recruited yet, that will lapse after 24 months again. Probably not as relevant to sites as it is to sponsor. One that is more relevant to everyone is archiving requirements is going up from 15 years to 25 years for drug studies. It can vary, obviously, depending on if you're working with, for example, a genetically modified product. You may have even longer archiving requirements. So do be aware and mindful of archiving requirements, particularly when we're doing that feasibility, that initial planning for study. Whose responsibility is it for archiving? Do we have the correct measures in place to archive for this length of time across what mediums? They're changing the timelines on request for further information deadline, again, more relevant to sponsors there. And as part of that transparency, I mentioned about publishing your study results. There's also a requirement for sponsors to register studies in a publicly accessible database under the World Health Organization approved databases there. And there's a requirement in specific timeframes on that. And as I mentioned, that trial is summary results within 12 months of the conclusion of the trial. It is possible as sponsor to request extension of that if necessary, but only a certain number of times will that be permitted. And in exceptional circumstances, sponsors can request to not do that, but that would be if it was, say, for example, around the interests of national security. Okay, so that's your recap on what what the overview changes are and why we changed them, just so you're all up to speed. I'm sure most of you are familiar with all of that already. We're now going to go into the recent updates. So I gave you the recap on where we were, and I'm going on to where we are now. So the biggest update we're hearing now is in risk. So I mentioned that risk proportionate approach is a really key aspect of the new regulations and a really key focus on it. Now, previously, what we were saying and what we were being told is that risk assessment would be a requirement of sponsor and sites would have to do a local risk assessment. The MHRA, on consideration of this and in writing their guidance, have sort of turned turned around a little bit on their thoughts around this, and they're now saying responsibility for trial-specific risk assessments lies with sponsor, not site. There should be proportionate approaches to research delivery encouraged at sites. So where there are variations between sites, that they're encouraging that proportionate approach. So that could result in variations locally, but these differences should be clearly outlined in the study protocol. And I'll give some examples in a moment of where that may occur. Research delivery staff should be supported in understanding and embracing these variations. So again, that comes from sponsor, with sponsors risk assessment, and if there are any variations at individual sites, then there should be support in that, in how sites can deliver that if they do vary in anything in a risk proportionate manner. It must be recognised that initiating independent location level risk assessments is not expected. So again, that's that change. We were hearing the message that they were wanting sites to do that, but they've now come to the conclusion that this may inadvertently delay study setup if individual sites are doing their own individual risk assessments that could vary between site and potentially could lead to delays in study setup. So that responsibility lies with sponsor now, but sites are encouraged to have that conversation around risk proportionate adoptability depending on their variations at site. So we've got a little quote here that's come from the NIHR in collaboration with the MHRA and the HRA. And we will be putting some messages out on our website as well. So this will be available on our website over the next few weeks. But they're saying that they do not routinely expect trial locations to perform their own trial-specific risk assessments, except where discussed in advance with the sponsor to manage risks associated with undertaking activities that go beyond standard practice or are not defined or mandated within the protocol or other trial-related documents. So the example they've given is during the pandemic, some vaccine trials were conducted in non-traditional settings, such as school gyms, rather than, a clinical or pharmacy-based environment. And so in such cases, it would have been appropriate for the trial location to liaise with sponsor to advise on risks that were specific to that setting, because it's non-traditional, it's outside of there, such as security, imp storage, participant safety, all of those aspects there. So that's where, if you know that your site has a variation that's slightly different to others, then there would be that conversation between site and sponsor. And it's important that sites are aware of that, but also that sponsor are aware that there may be variations in sites, and to initiate those conversations as well very early on during those initial feasibility things. It should be noted as well, we've got this following quote here, that risk assessments do still play an important role in the development of a trial location's standardised practices via development of the overarching quality system for trial conduct in general. So basically, that's part of your feasibility process. It was already being done. You're looking at those differences that there may be there, and it's still a key part of it. Even if it's not that formal risk assessment, you're still having that. And it's important for sites to be aware of their individual differences and their different participant populations. There can be great variety in different areas where there may be different risks to that study conduct, to the layout, to the logistics. It could be something as simple as if for studies being run in London, it's much more likely, if you've got home visits, for example, that your research team will have to travel on public transport. So how do you manage the security of carrying study imps or blood samples versus, in a more rural setting, it's more likely to be driving in cars. And so are there different risks to consider there around that? It could be something as simple as collecting a blood sample from a participant and transporting it to labs. Some sites, it may be that, they just have to walk down the corridor. Some sites, it may be that it has to be transported across the city to a different site because there isn't a lab physically at that location. And so you've got an additional site-specific risk there around how that would be managed. So it's about having that awareness and having those conversations earlier on. Even though we're not doing that formal risk assessment at site now, we're still having that awareness of it. Okay, so that's the update on risk guidance documents. So I've mentioned this in the last webinar. So alongside those clinical trial regulations and GCP, there will be guidance documents available from the MHRA and the HRA to support implementation of these. And it's that recognition that sometimes actually interpreting the language around these documents practically can be quite challenging. And so they've got these specific guidance documents on certain areas. Now, the HRA documents are currently now available. They were in draft format. I believe these are now finalized. So I'm just gonna, I know you can't click on the link in the slides there, so I'm gonna pop the link in the chat to you there if you wish to have a look at those. So they are now in place. The MHRA guidance is still in process. There is some draft guidance available, so I'll pop the link in the chat for you there as well if you wish to have that. So there is some draft guidance available, but they are still writing the rest of their draft guidance. And we are now expecting the final MHRA guidance. I've just heard it would be expected in January. So we were originally hoping for the summer. Most recently, we were looking at December. It's now looking at January. So it's being aware when that guidance will come out. That should then give sites and sponsors that greater understanding and measures to put in place to support how they're delivering studies in line with these new regulations. Okay, the other big update from me as well is training requirements. So it is in GCP, it's not actually written how often GCP needs to be updated. I know for a lot of people, you may have a local requirement of 2 or 3 years. In GCP, that's not actually stated in there. It's a local requirement. However, it does state that GCP training must be updated after any significant change, and this update does count as a significant change. So if GCP training is required for your role, then it will be a requirement for your GCP to be updated in line with these changes in April. Even if you only did it, say, a year ago, it will be a requirement to update that. It should be proportionate to your role, though, as well. And there's been a big push around proportionate GCP training. So if someone is doing a very, very limited aspect of the study, or they're doing their usual clinical duties, it just happens to be part of a study and the data goes into that. You may have a phlebotomist, for example, who's just collecting 1 extra vial of blood. They're taking blood anyway, and that blood goes to the trial team and they deal with everything from there. It wouldn't be proportionate for the phlebotomist to do GCP training, for example. The GCP update training, so as I said, if it's required for your role, you do need to update it. It doesn't need to be done bang on the 28th of April. It can be completed within, and this is the official MHRA wording here, a reasonable time frame of the new regulations being in place. So that basically that translates as within approximately 6 to 12 months of it, and this should be managed in a risk proportionate way. So obviously, if you've got a higher risk study, then you may prioritize staff on that study or those studies doing their GCP training sooner. If you've got a study where you know there have been errors picked up in inspections or monitoring or audit, then you may prioritize those team members doing that. But it doesn't have to, people don't have to all be trained exactly on that time point. So you've got that reasonable time frame to fill that in. Also, it's something to bear in mind as well. If we do train everyone at a site at exactly the same time, in 2 or 3 years' time, whatever your regulation, you've got everyone having to do it at the same time again. So it does logistically make more sense if you can spread that out in that risk proportionate way. It's going to be easier for us to deliver the training, but also it's going to be much easier for you at site to manage that whenever you're looking at GCP certificate updates requirements. Okay, so the GCP training requirements available. So if GCP is required for your role, what we try and avoid saying full GCP, but if that is required, then we've got the introduction to GCP for those brand new. You've got the GCP refresher for those that need that update. So this will be the one that people, I'm imagining, will be primarily going for with this new regulation change. And there's also an optional GCP consolidation, which kind of complements the introduction to give that greater level of detail. And then if you've got staff who only require an awareness in the role, then the NIHR Learn has some e-learning courses available on there around research practice in clinical settings or research practice in wider healthcare and community settings. And in Wales, we also have what's called our research awareness fact sheet that can be used again for example, a receptionist in a research active GP surgery. It wouldn't be necessary for them to conduct full GCP training, but it'd be handy for them to just have a basic awareness of research and what's going on, such as, data should be anonymous, that kind of thing. So if they see anything lying around, it gets managed that way. There's also fundamental training available again on NIHR Learn for those staff doing limited roles in specialist areas such as labs or pharmacy. So your lead person in labs or your lead pharmacist may very well require full GCP, but if someone is just dispensing the study IMP, then they may not require full GCP. You've got those ones as well. And the NIHR are in the process of updating all of their training, of their e-learning on NIHR Learn at the moment. And I'm in the working group supporting that. So we've got oversight from a Welsh perspective as well. A little bit of update, so a bit more information on GCP training specifically. So if GCP is required for your role, then we've got, as I mentioned, that introduction to GCP for those brand new. This is only available as e-learning on NIHR Learn. We will have a new GCP refresher coming in. This will be available as e-learning and facilitator-led. And by facilitator-led, I mean either in a face-to-face setting or virtually via Teams with one of our skilled research GCP facilitators teaching the session. They are interactive and have a lot of group discussion activity to enhance that learning. And so you'll be able to choose either or, whereas with the introduction, you can't. It's e-learning or nothing. So with Refresh, people will be able to choose either or. And then the GCP consolidation, which I mentioned, is the optional extra. So for those completing their introduction to GCP e-learning, if they feel like they need a little bit more detail, then we've got the GCP consolidation, which is available facilitator-led, face-to-face or virtually on Teams. It's that optional extra for the ones that want that greater depth, but we are now seeing it being used in CAPAs as an action to say, we think our staff should all do the GCP consolidation as an action if we're having errors happening. And we're also seeing it being listed as a recommendation in MHRA inspections if they're finding errors at site. MHRA inspectors are now suggesting teams attend that GCP consolidation for that greater depth of learning. And then there's other associated GCP training, just to make you aware of. There's a lot of work going in the background around updating this. So there's specific additional training on NIHR Learn around specialist informed consent, for example, for adult psychic capacity, paediatrics. That's all being updated and reviewed. In health and care research roles, we've got our own training available as well. So we've got these e-learning courses available, and the Managing Essential Records is split into multiple mini modules. These are all being updated currently at the moment, and we're hoping to have these available in the new year. And then we've got our health and care research roles facilitator-led training. So we've got the GCP consolidation and refresher, which are, we have to rely on the NIHR to supply those. And then these ones that we manage ourselves, our PI workshop, which looks at principal investigator oversight, our valid informed consent and research. And then we've got 2 pilot courses as well we're running at the moment to gauge need. We've got Managing Essential Records in Research, which is a practical course that complements the e-learning, where people physically look at sorting and organising a site file and do activities there. And we've also got another pilot on good research practice, which is for those on non-drug studies who do not require GCP training, but still require some training. So all of these are in the process of being updated. A bit of a timeline on when they'll be available. So the GCP e-learning available on NIHR Learn should be available early 2026. They're hoping to have it available in December. It may be more like January. So you'll be able to start getting teams getting that e-learning done from January ahead of that change in April for the CT reg, so you can plan that out. And then the associated e-learning that they've got there should come alongside that as well. The facilitator-led GCP courses are going to come out slightly later than the e-learning. So if you do have people you need to get trained straight away, then you can send them straight to the e-learning. So the facilitator-led GCP refresher, the e-learning will be available from early 26. But we haven't got a release date yet for this. We're aiming for somewhere between January and April, but because the MHRA guidance is now coming out later than anticipated, there's a delay because the MHRA have to review all of that in line with their guidance. So we will have those facilitator-led courses, but they're coming out slightly later than we'd hoped. However, because we now have that message that's saying it should be completed within the reasonable time frame, there's no pressure to get everyone trained up by the 28th of April. So you have that time to get people trained and to spread it out. The focus is going to be on getting that facilitator-led refresher out as soon as possible. And then the GCP consolidation will be coming out in spring. Okay, so there's some useful links there. I've shared those guidance documents for you in the chat. I can also pop in the guidance documents there for you, the clinical trial regulations and the new GCP, if you would like to take the time to read those through, or if you prefer me just summarising you, that's fine. Obviously the updated GCP training will reflect all of these changes and will include exercises and awareness in things like the changes to risk and that sort of thing. So it will bring that messaging in there. Okay, I'm now going to pass over to Gurmel to look at the current position with plan changes to approvals.
Thank you, Kat. I've got slide envy now. So, right, okay, I'll crack on with this. Just a little précis before I go into the recap from last time, in terms of where we are and where we're going. So there's 6 months to go in regards to the new clinical trials regulations. So the magic date being the 28th of April 2026. These are the most significant updates to UK clinical trial regulations in 2 decades, and that will come into force. This is to help researchers and sponsors prepare. The MHRA and the HRA have also published this, this month actually, being November. I beg your pardon, they offered it in October, explaining the change that and how to get ready for it. So the new regulations will cover items such as strengthening patient safety and participant protection, streamlining the approval process, and increasing transparency and inclusion in research. So these updates aim to make things simpler and faster to run high quality trials whilst maintaining safety and public trust. So that's a very high level précis as to why there's a lot of things going on. And there will be some items I'll cover which potentially been duplicated by Kat. And as Kat caveat at the beginning, we're just updating you. We don't know the nuances, we don't know the details, but we think it's so important to keep the community up to date. So on screen at the moment, I'm just offering, albeit very small, but this was the last session that we did during the summer. And we covered items like definitions of terminology, pharmacovigilance, etc. These items are available on this following link, and I'm assuming that the presentation will be made available. If not, I can put the link in the chat. What I'm hoping to cover this afternoon is new IRS, modifications, non-NHS site-specific reviews, and ASLAC capacity and or children. So last time I left you with a slide. It was a bit of a cliffhanger, and it's regarding IRAS. So IRAS, I'm sure, I can't see people's faces, but I'm sure they're delighted that IRAS is going to be somewhat changed. And what I can offer you is that following extensive engagement across the research sector, we have agreed that the name of the new service that will come into play, and that will be called Plan and Manage Health and Care Research. The new platform will aim to replace existing systems, including IRAS, as we know it, with one streamlined service that enables users to plan, approve, set up, manage, and complete health and care research in one place. So at the moment, it's very bitty in terms of researchers will use IRAS. Then a little bit of magic happens in the background when it comes to our local systems that we call HARP. But this is all going to happen in one place. Now, in terms of when this will be actually out there, it's still very much in a I'm not going to say development phase, because we have moved with it, but it's not going to be anytime soon, because we want to make sure that this process and the system is robust. But again, it's just to update you that this will be coming. Furthermore, this new service supports the government 10-year health plan, and it's an ambitious plan that sets out the life sciences sector plan, creating, again, a streamlined research environment needed to make the UK Europe's leading life science economy by 2030. So by creating a connected future-ready system, we're hoping and helping researchers to work more efficiently, reducing duplication and strengthening the UK's global reputation as a leader in health and life sciences. It's quite well recognised that other countries out there might have the financial backing, and some pharmaceutical companies, for example, or even non-NHS or academic institutes, etc., they preferably go outside of the UK, but we want to make the UK a really attractive place. So if we have that one person, in a sense, to come here, then we'd like to encourage international studies, as well as homegrown studies, to be more attractive and a robust process. So again, I'm going to offer the 10th of December. So 10th of December, we've selected a few sponsors who will start to use the first part of this new service, and they'll focus on making changes to existing studies. They'll start with the studies with the simplest approval pathway, so those being the studies that do not require REC results, so the non-REC studies. Again, so there's the select few that will be doing this, and even though the initial rollout will be limited, it's a really exciting step in starting to open our new service to other users as well. This isn't a photo from me from weekend of Halloween. You'll be forgiven for thinking so. So from April, again, the magic date being April 28, 2026, modifications will be formally known as amendments. Get the link, see, formally known as. And therefore, we will no longer use the term amendment for changes to approved trials. So the use modification, which is the terminology used by nations within the European Union to describe changes to clinical trials of an investigational medicinal product, aka CTIMP, this will make sure there is better alignment between the UK and the international research community. So how will modifications be categorized? And myself and Kat have heard this from the research community. What does this mean? What's it going to look like? So there's going to be three categorizations. There'll be substantial modifications, modifications of important details, and minor modifications. And what I'm about to offer now is quite a lot of information, but again, I will put it in the chat box so you can all look at it. But again, I'll offer it presently. So substantial modifications. If the sponsor wants to make substantial modification to an approved trial, they'll need to submit a substantial modification request. This request must clearly identify the proposed substantial modification and state whether it relates to the REC and or the MHRA, so that can be reviewed by the relevant regulatory authority. Substantial modifications may also need other approvals. So for example, Health HRA and Health and Care Research Wales, depending on the type of modification that it is. So these substantial modifications are considered to be modifications to a clinical trial approved, which is likely to have substantial impact on the safety or rights of participants or on the reliability or robustness of the data generated by that trial. Again, some substantial modifications are further classified as a route of A or B, and the MHRA will process a substantial modification differently depending on whether it is route A or B. Full details on routes A and B of modifications can be found on the MHRA website. Again, I will offer this in the chat function after I've done my little presentation, so you can go there and have a look yourself. But again, this information is not provided here as in this session because there's quite a lot of information to be explored there. The second type of modification or categorization, I should say, is modification of an important detail. So the 2025 regulations introduced this term, modification of an important detail. This is a modification that does not significantly impact participant safety or rights, which the MHRA and REC only need to be made aware, basically for administrative purposes or oversight purposes. These types of modifications are not reviewed by the REC committees or MHRA, and no outcome will be issued. They're just for information only. But these modifications may, however, need other approvals. So again, it may come to the Health Research Authority, HRA, or Health and Care Research Wales. The third type of modification, the categorization, is minor modifications. So minor modifications are changes that do not fall into the category of substantial modification or modification of an important detail. This is not a term which is used in the 2025 regulations, but is a term which will be used to describe these types of modifications. These can be implemented at any time without informing the MHRA or Research Ethics Committee, although other approvals, again, Health and Care Research Wales, HRA, may be required. So as I said, it's a lot of information there. I will offer it to you and share it to you in the chat function. But again, it's just sharing what is coming ahead. So in regards to the non-NHS site-specific reviews, again, other updates. The update of the clinical trial regulations that will come into play next year will remove the requirements for RECs to review non-NHS sites and investigators, which means that committees will no longer need to review the non-NHS site-specific information form. But however, the RECs will be expected to review the sponsor arrangements for selecting sites and principal investigators as part of the main application. So next year as well, another piece of news is that seeking an expert for review when a REC receives a CTIMP application proposing to recruit adults lacking capacity to give consent and or children will no longer be a legal requirement under the new CT regulations. This has been removed as a legal requirement to allow for more flexibility during the REC review process and so that each application can be managed in a proportionate way. If the REC do feel that if their opinion that they do need an expert or anything in relation to an application, the committee can still obtain expert advice when the amended regulations come into force. However, this will not be a decision made by the committee this will be a decision made by the committee on a case-by-case basis, and is no longer a legal requirement for applications that involve recruiting children and adults lacking capacity. So quite a big change there. And that, hopefully, in a nutshell, is the current updates. As I said, it's not finalized, but a précis and a high level of what's going on. So that being said, if everyone's happy, I shall stop sharing